kids, how are you? Today we are going back to the Wild West for our story time. But before we get into our story, I'm going to tell you a few fun facts about the Wild West that you may or may not know. For example, did you know that all the kids in the Wild West, unless they had a school in their town, they didn't go to school at all? Most adults and most kids didn't know how to read or write, so they had to find creative ways to talk to each other and pass history down. And also, they didn't have any TVs or radios, so the biggest way of entertaining themselves and their kids was to tell stories. But since most of them didn't know how to read or write, they made up these stories out of their head, and then they would, if their kids liked them, they would keep telling them, and then their kids would grow up and tell their kids, and that was how stories that we know today are created, like the stories about vampires and werewolves and evil witches. Mostly came out of times like this to keep kids scared of wandering off at night because it was wild. There was no police, there was no street lights, so they wanted their kids to stay close to home when it got dark, so they used to tell them scary stories to make them want to be inside at nighttime. Also, since they didn't have any TVs, they would put on what we call plays, which we still have today. But they did them a lot more than we do now. And again, most people didn't know how to read and write, so they would make the plays up as they go. Some people did know how to read and write, and they would teach their children, and they would teach others. Some villages had school houses, which is one room. They would fit the whole school in one room. So if you were lucky and your village or town, like this one behind me, had a school, you were able to learn. But there wasn't very many of them. Education wasn't very important because it took a lot to survive in this time. Mostly if you were a little kid and your father or mother owned what we know today as a grocery store, as soon as you could walk and talk, you were working in the grocery store. If your parents were doctors, you were working as a doctor. Whatever your parents did, you did, including farming. So going to school wasn't a big option. And the only way to entertain ourselves in this time in the Wild West was to put on plays, to tell stories. And since there was no radios, the only music you heard was when people played live, which is mostly pianos, guitars, banjos, stuff like that. And again, there was no music school, so you had to learn from whoever knew how to play an instrument in your village. So it's very hard to entertain yourself. So in honor of the Wild West, and the fact that story time was the kids' most favorite time, I'm bringing you back to tell you a story about Thanksgiving. I'm going to do a few of these, so I hope you like them. Today we're going to read The Littlest Pilgrim, because this is a great story about how many littles out there that are watching this. You hear all the time, you're too little for that, you're too little for this, you're too little. You've heard this, right? Well, even back then, they were telling their kids they were too little. But we'll see what little people can really do. So let's start reading The Littlest Pilgrim. Ready? The Littlest Pilgrim. I'm going to read it and then I'll show you the pictures because it's very, very hard to see the writing on this camera. Okay, this is Minnie, by the way. Minnie was a pilgrim. She lived with her family in a small village. See how little her village is? Just a few houses. Looks like fall time like now, huh? There were many pilgrims in her village, but Minnie was the littlest one. Isn't she cute, little Minnie? Look at her hat that they wore. A lot of pilgrims wore them hats, those hats, and dresses like this. They had aprons so they didn't get dirty. And most pilgrims, they wore the same dress all week and washed it once a week. Could you imagine having to go run around to go to school or whatever you do at home wearing the same outfit all week? It would be pretty stinky, right? But they didn't know the difference back then. We call that hygiene today, kids. Even though she was small, Minnie tried to help with the village chores. Ooh, looks like she's collecting apples. Apples are my favorite, especially in fall. And apple juice. One day, Minnie decided to be extra helpful. So she is thinking on a little bench there. They did still have benches back then. Benches were mostly what people sat on. We didn't have recliners or couches. We did have chairs, though, and kitchen tables. Minnie found her big brother by the house. He was stacking wood for the winter. She wanted to help. That was how they stayed warm. They didn't have heating in their house except fireplaces. So they would have to chop their own wood and carry it in every single day. And this is where they went potty. There was no toilets inside the house. You had to go outside to go potty back then. Can you imagine how cold that was in the winter? Look, brother, Minnie said. I am helping to make a wood pile. But Minnie's brother was too busy to notice her. When you're that age, when you were back in the Pilgrim days, you worked long, hard hours. You were up before the sun, and you went to bed probably around 5 or 6 o'clock at night, because that's when it got dark. Isn't that nuts? No video games, nothing. Minnie went inside the house and found her big sister. She was mending a dress. Most people knew how to sew, especially at young ages, because that's how you made your own clothing. Or your mother made your clothing. You didn't have a store to go get made clothing. You could get fabric, but there was no made dresses, there was no made socks, there was no made bonnets. You had to do all that yourself, mostly, and put your own buttons on. So there's Minnie's sister hard at work repairing a torn dress because they had to wear them for as long as they could. Most people couldn't get access to fabric all the time. I'm ready to sew, said Minnie. Sorry, Minnie, her sister said. You are too little to help with mending. Go help Mama. I'm busy. Oh, dear. How many times did you try to help your siblings? And they're like, no, go. I got this. You have to go help or go get something to do from Mom. It's very frustrating, right? But look at her. She obviously has a lot to mend. And there's not a lot of daylight hours back then. They had to make use of all the hours in the day. So Minnie went outside to help her mother. She was at the oven baking bread for dinner. Didn't have an oven in your house either. You had to cook outside. That was probably really cold in the winter. Look, Mama, said Minnie, I am helping. But Minnie's mother was so busy making bread, she didn't even hear Minnie. Oh my goodness, how many times have you tried to get Mommy or Daddy's attention, but they're so busy? And they didn't even hear you, and you have to say it a couple times. Mommy, I'm helping. Mommy, look. They still did that back then. Parents are always busy. Doesn't mean they don't love you, though. They're just busy, like I said. They only could work in the daylight hours. And this time of year, we have less daylight than we normally do. So they got to work, work, work. Minnie went to find her father. Surely he would want some help. He was getting ready to hunt for food in the forest. That's how people got their meat. They couldn't go buy meat at the grocery store like we do today. You had to hunt. Most of them had muskets and guns or arrows. Sorry, Minnie, you are too little for hunting, Minnie's father said when he saw her. Why don't you go pick some berries for us to eat? It's too much for a little one to be walking around in the woods. You have to be very quiet when you're hunting because the animals have better ears than we do. So if you step on a stick, they'll run. If you move too fast, they'll run. And it's very important back then to get meat for your family. So they usually went off hunting by themselves. But at least he gave her something else to do, right? As Minnie walked towards the berry bushes, she spotted her neighbor. He was fixing the door to his house. Yes, most people back then, you didn't buy a house. You had to build the house with your whole family, and they were very small. Most families lived in one-room houses, very, very teeny. Look at that. A straw roof, a chimney to stay warm, very simple windows, not too fancy. I can help, Minnie started to say. Sorry, Minnie, this is a big job, and you're too little. Oh, dear. Look, she wanted to help him, but she's holding up a nail so he could hammer them, but didn't want her help. Must be he was trying to get as much done in the daylight, too. Minnie wandered through the village. She was sad. Oh, poor Minnie. She just wanted to help. Look, everybody's houses pretty much look the same. And there was no cars back then. They moved by horses or carriages, so the streets weren't very big either. And most of them, there was no big city, so there's only a couple houses clustered together, and that's what they call the village. Isn't that crazy? Minnie just wanted to help, but everyone was too busy to notice, or they thought the jobs were too big and Minnie was too little. It wasn't fair. Poor Minnie. Look at her. She looks sad. She just wants to help. Hopefully she finds someone. Minnie walked toward the water. She spotted some boys from her village. They were fishing. Just like hunting, that's the only way that you could get meat, was either hunting or fishing by water. And when it was very, very important, and again, the best time to catch fish is early in the morning or almost right before dark. So you didn't have very long to get fish. Can I help you fish? Minnie asked one of the boys. He laughed. Oh, sorry, Minnie, you're too little for fishing. He's probably scared that she would fall in the water. Back then, they didn't have a lot of doctors, and if you got a lot of people went to heaven just from colds back then because they didn't have medicine either. So they're just looking out for Minnie, but she thinks that they don't want their help. Now Minnie was very sad. Why would no one let her help? Minnie knew there had to be something special she could do, even if she was little. Poor little Minnie. She's sad. She just wants to help. Look, she saw a snail. Maybe she can talk to the snail and keep the snail company. Minnie started to walk home and saw some berries along the way. As she picked them, she heard something rustling in the leaves. Minnie moved closer to get a better look. Look at all them beautiful fall trees. She's wandering a little bit from her village. That was very dangerous back then. There at the edge of the forest stood a girl. Ooh! That's what they used to call back in the day Native, but we know them today as Native Americans. Look at there's apples in the tree. I would have picked an apple and ate it. Can you see how different she dressed? Look, her clothes are very simple. She has a nice beaded necklace, and look at Minnie. Minnie had a hat, an apron, and a colorful dress, so they dressed very different back then. And she was little, just like Minnie. She found another one that was little, just like her. Hello, said Minnie. What's your name? Ooh, look, they're the same height. I bet you Minnie's very happy. It's hard being the littlest one, isn't it? The girl stood still and looked at Minnie. She didn't say a word. Back then, natives didn't speak the same language as Minnie did, so she probably didn't know what she was saying at all. Just like, huh? What are you saying? Didn't know how to respond. Minnie remembered the berries she held in her hand. Do you want one? She asked. Aw, sharing is very nice. It's a good way to make friends, right? Maybe. Oh, look at her. She's holding her tummy. She must be very hungry. Minnie's helping. At first, the girl just stared at Minnie, but soon she began to smile, a very big smile. Yes, she was hungry. She was probably trying to get berries, too. Minnie was too little for many things, but she was not too little to make a friend. Aw, they made friends. That's cute. The end. So, what we call the moral of the story, or what the story means, is sometimes we're just too little to help, and it's not because they don't want our help, but it's because you might get hurt. And you know what? One day, especially back in these days, once you got big, you were working all the time, and you didn't have time to just enjoy being a kid. So, if everybody tells you you're too little, enjoy it, because one day, you're going to be so big that you're going to have to work all the time, and you're not going to get to go off and pick berries or do whatever you want. So don't take it too hard if you're too little for things. It just means you still have time to be a kid. I hope you liked this story. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Thanks for coming to the Wild West with me. Bye.